welcome to our final Thought Leadership webinar of 2020, a year that has left its mark on us all. And for many, it's also been a catalyst to find strength and resilience in times of isolation and difficulty. And Terry Waite, Alistair Campbell, and Peter Piot illustrated this so movingly and inspiringly in their conversations with our erudite and open-hearted webinar host, Lord Daniel Finkelstein. Good evening, Danny, and welcome. Later this evening, Danny will be hosting vaccine researcher and infectious disease consultant, Dr. Anna Goodwin, in a version of everything you wanted to know about the vaccine, but were afraid to ask. We don't have Woody Allen, but we have Anna, and thank you so much, Anna, for agreeing to join us at short notice and give us the heads up on all those nagging vaccine questions and all the ambiguous answers, which you, I know, are going to clarify for us tonight. But first, we're delighted to welcome the thought-leading economist and writer, Noreena Hertz, for her much anticipated conversation with Danny Finkelstein, himself no slouch as an economist and a serial winner of Political Commentator of the Year. Noreena was named by The Observer as one of the world's leading thinkers and by Vogue magazine as one of the world's most inspiring women. Can you beat that? So Noreena, no further CV is needed here, and I'm not going to say any more. We just want to listen to you. Noreena's latest book, The Lonely Century, Coming Together in a World That's Pulling Apart, has had rave reviews, with the Guardian reviewer saying, if we could issue a reading list to number 10 Downing Street, I'd put this book at the top. Again, what an accolade. And you can buy signed copies of Noreena's book for £35, including a donation to One by simply going to the chat during the evening and replying yes to Abby's question, would you like to buy a book? All you have to put is yes or yes, please, if you want to be polite. And the book is a terrific read. It's a crucial call to arms and a call to harness the power of community. Traditional community bonds may be fragmenting in our Western world, but they're very much alive and well in the rural Eastern Cape of South Africa where we work. And that's why we have a community approach to mother-child health. And the old African proverb that it takes a village to raise a child is so true. And it's so important that every member of that village receives our support, and more about that later. But now it's time to hand over to Danny for his conversation with Noreena. Danny, over to you.
Noreena, hello. Thank you so much for agreeing to do this. It was certainly an act of courage for me because I don't know, one of the most awkward moments I've ever had on television was when we both appeared together on a panel in front of a large audience of drunk Channel 4 students at closing time, chaired by, I think, Jimmy Carr, maybe it was David Mitchell. Let's just say that I didn't have the better of the argument on austerity. Anyway, I'm really happy to have a chance to talk to you about your terrific book, really interesting, challenging book that you've written, which I really recommend to everybody on the call. And I know we're going to be talking about the chance to buy that book as well. But I want to start by asking you to tell us some of the data that persuaded you that in writing a book about loneliness, you were writing a book about something not only that mattered, but had become increasingly important.
Yes, so maybe what would be helpful would be to share with you why I decided to write this book in the first place. It was really a few different things happening at once. I was teaching at university, and what I noticed was that my students, increasing numbers of my students, were coming to my office in office hours and confiding in me how lonely and isolated they felt. And this, I'd been teaching at university for about 20 years, and this was a really new phenomenon. And there was something else that I was observing when I sent my students group assignments. Many seem to be finding it quite hard to interact in person, like much more challenging than they had in the past. And I raised it with a colleague, the president of one of America's most illustrious Ivy League universities, this observation. He said, we're seeing exactly the same thing here. In fact, it's so bad here, we're having to run remedial how to read a face in real life classes, because we have so many students coming who are spending so much time on their phones that they really are not au fait with face-to-face in-person interaction. So that was a kind of, okay, that's interesting observation. At the same time, I was with my academic research, getting increasingly interested in trying to understand the rise of right-wing populism across the world. And I started interviewing and hearing from right-wing populist voters in France, in Germany, in Italy, Trump voters in the United States. And from their stories, what kept on coming across time and time again was how lonely they had felt until they found community in the right-wing populist movements. And I started digging into the academic literature as well, and found that there was a body of literature that had been looking at the link between people who felt socially isolated, people whose communities were fractured, and the rise of right-wing populism. And then the third kind of insight happening at roughly the same time was that I had bought, and I'm sorry if any of you have one in your room, and she now gets very excited, I had bought an Amazon Alexa. And I noticed in my interactions with my Alexa that I was, feeling increasingly attached and affectionate towards her. And it made me think about the role that artificial intelligence and social robots are likely to play in our futures moving forwards. And I started digging into that. So I had these kind of, one very first-hand insight into young people feeling really lonely. And that's actually one of the really interesting things about my research, was that before I'd started digging into this subject, I probably thought that loneliness affected elderly people the most, but it's actually the young who are the loneliest. Then there was this link with the rise of right-wing populism. And then there was this fact that, as I write about in the book, a whole economy, a loneliness economy had emerged and was emerging to address the problems of isolation and loneliness that we feel, that so many people feel. And really so many people feel this because in the United Kingdom, for example, 1 in 5 adults, even before the pandemic, felt lonely, often or always. And amongst young people, amongst 18 to 24-year-olds or children, significantly higher numbers, as high as 50%.
Yes, that was one of the things that struck me about the book. It was a slam dunk start, actually. Right at the beginning, you really established your case that this was a big problem with some of these really chunky numbers, not 1 in 20 people talking about being lonely, which is a significant social problem. But I think you did earn the right to call it a crisis, because you do call it that, by talking about figures like 30% or 50%, sometimes really big figures. Did you have any idea when people were talking about that, whether they were just talking about isolated incidents of loneliness, or do you think it's a much more pervasive feeling?
So I define loneliness actually in a broader sense to the way that we typically think of it, because when we typically think about loneliness, we think about a feeling of lacking company, companionship, or intimacy, craving the support and care of those who are meant to be closest to us. But I define loneliness as that, but also feeling disconnected from your fellow citizens, from your employer, from the state, about feeling unsupported and uncared for by your workplace and your government. So I define loneliness as a state of being that is political as well as personal, that is driven by a whole host of structural drivers and not just the way we treat ourselves. And so, but of course, much of the data that I've used is actually to establish that loneliness is a crisis is actually using a narrower definition. So were we to have significant survey data on this broader definition, the crisis would be many folds worse.
And you're saying that people can feel lonely when they're surrounded by other people, and can also be alone and not feel lonely.
Yes, and for sure. I mean, the loneliness in a crowd, the loneliness in big cities. Big cities can be very lonely places. The loneliness of being in a bad relationship, in a bad marriage, in an abusive marriage. So yes, you can definitely be lonely when you're with others. And likewise, you can be on your own and not feel lonely, for sure. And the two are not equated, although the research does show that you are more likely to feel lonely if you are on your own, and you're also more likely to feel lonely more regularly.
So obviously, as well as proving that it's prevalent and deep, in order to show there's a crisis, you also have to show that loneliness is bad. And then you try and, well, you succeed, I think, in making that argument. It was interesting. I read Scott Thoreau wrote a piece about the use in the United States of solitary confinement, and he was making in the New Yorker a lot of arguments about why that was bad. And you are in the same territory, but with a lot of new data I hadn't seen, or on arguments I hadn't seen. So maybe you could share with everyone why the way that you established that loneliness is something that's serious and problematic and ought to be of concern to all of us.
So when we think of loneliness, I think we typically think of it as something that affects our mental health. And there is a lot of research that shows that it does that, and shows that there's a clear link between loneliness and feelings of anxiety, feelings of depression, and at the worst, feelings of suicide, suicidal feelings. But it was only when I started really digging into the scientific literature that I realized how damaging loneliness is to our physical health as well. With loneliness as bad for our physical health as smoking 15 cigarettes a day, loneliness increases our risk of heart disease, of stroke, of dementia, and even of getting cancer. And if we're lonely and we're sick, we're less likely to recover as well. And why this is, it's essentially because of the way we're designed. You know, we have been designed in an evolutionary sense, as creatures, to be creatures of togetherness. We are hardwired to connect. And so when we are feeling lonely and disconnected from others, we actually have a pretty smart kind of biological response, which is to make ourselves feel so bad physically that we do everything that we can to connect with others. So when we feel lonely, our blood pressure goes up, our heart rate goes up, our stress levels, our cortisol levels go up, everything kind of telling us go and be with other people. And when we don't respond in that way, as in contemporary society, we don't, what happens is we're in this state of fight or flight, high stress response for a period of time. And in the same way that, you know, it's great to put your car in first gear in order to take off and accelerate, but were you to drive your car in first gear for a protracted amount of time or over time, that would be very bad for your engine. Well, being lonely for a protracted period of time, which actually can be quite short. So, you know, studies have shown that even feeling lonely for less than 2-year periods has a marked impact on your health. Yeah, so that's the reason why it's so bad for us physically as well.
Noreena, I hope that our audience is going to ask you questions as well, and anybody who's listening, please put that in the Q&A rather than the chat for me, and I'll try and get round to them. But obviously, the third part of asserting it's a crisis, you say it's the lonely century, and that's referring to the century we're in, as opposed to the 20th century. So you know, we could say, well, people have always been lonely, and there have been lonely old people the whole time. Why the 21st century, or not? How did you establish that the 21st century was more lonely than the 20th centuries or centuries before that?
So, well, the term loneliness was only started really being kind of discussed in the 19th century. So before that, there wasn't even really a kind of discussion in literature, interestingly, around loneliness. But why I'm kind of really dating why I've really kind of said that this is the lonely century, because it's because of a combination of factors that are accelerating why this is how we feel. Mass migration to cities, you know, a relatively new phenomenon, or accelerating phenomenon. More people live on their own now than at any time in the past. Technology, a very significant driver. Are smartphones, as I argue, really part of the problem. Fascinating research that even if we just have our phones on a table, when smartphones were put on a table between couples, even when the smartphones were turned off, even when neither of the couple was touching them, the couple felt less connected and less empathetic towards each other. Social media massively exacerbating the problem. When I started my research, I was pretty agnostic as to the role that social media was playing in the contemporary loneliness crisis, but having really dug into the literature and also interviewed especially young people on this subject, teenagers, I came away feeling very convinced that social media really is in many ways the tobacco industry of the 21st century and needs to be regulated as such, playing a really significant role. And when studies have been done where teenagers, for example, stopped using Facebook for a period of time, students were found to be considerably happier, considerably less lonely, and do considerably more in person with others.
It's a bit counterintuitive, isn't it? This I'm convinced of it, but it is counterintuitive, because you would think, well, this is a way that you know, I can be in touch with somebody that I haven't seen for 20 years. My son, my middle son, is still in contact with all the people he was at primary school with, even though he hasn't seen them. Those are people that dropped out of my life completely. So why is social media not just a connector?
Yes. So yes. So as I make explicit in the book, there are ways and there are people for whom social media definitely plays a positive role. And, you know, your son's example, staying in touch with his primary school friends, or someone who doesn't fit into their physical environment, the LGBTQ kid who's living in a small town and doesn't meet anyone around them who is like them. Of course, there are those situations, but I think the reason social media on balance net is bad for how connected we are, it is for these reasons. First, there is an incredible amount of abuse and bullying on these platforms. I'm not just talking about hate speech here. I'm talking about just bullying and abuse. 65% of UK students have experienced cyberbullying. 1 in 3 UK females have experienced abuse on Facebook. And so there is a kind of nastiness on these social media, which actually the platforms, well, neither do enough to address, but also it's in their interest for this kind of toxic discourse to remain there, because actually the more hateful the comments, the more aggressive the comments, the more angry the comments, the more they're shared, it turns out, and the more people stay on the platforms, which is how they make money. So these are kind of, you know, can be for many people pretty damaging environments, hostile environments, which make them feel more on their own. But also they're, for many young people especially, excluding in a very direct way, insofar as For young people, much of their social lives has migrated to their screens. And in my interviews with young people, I was really struck by comments like that of Peter, a 14-year-old London schoolboy, who told me so painfully about how when he posts on Instagram, he's waiting, hoping that somebody will like his posts. And if they don't, asking himself, what have I done wrong? Or another story that a parent shared with me of how their child was at school and everyone's phones pinged and they'd got WhatsApp message groups inviting them to something and their daughter hadn't, and she was kind of had to pretend that she had, but she was thinking everyone else is invited to stuff. And even though of course there were always cases of children being excluded in the past, what makes it different now is that in the past, an adult often could see this was going on and intervene. So a teacher would see a child not being asked to sit with other children and would intervene, or a parent would see a child not being invited to do something. And nowadays, the adult typically isn't aware of it, yet the exclusion is all too visible for to the child and their peers. And the other, I mean, and a couple of other reasons why too, because if you look on your social media feeds, for those of you who are on social media, and if you're not, it's worth just going onto it just to see what happens there. The things people post typically very idealized versions of their own life. Oh, I had so much fun this weekend with so-and-so, and kind of all happy pictures. And it's very easy to develop a belief that others are more popular than you, that you are less lonely. So in kind of like a relative sense, it's easy to feel alone too. So those are, but technology is just one of the drivers. And another one of the drivers, and I know this is somewhere where we won't always agree, Danny, is I put neoliberal capitalism kind of in the, I really single it out as one of the reasons. I'm not anti-capitalist. I want to preface it with this. But what I argue is that really, and this predates this century, because from the 1980s onwards, what happened was a very particular model of capitalism, neoliberalism, championed by Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher, initially became really the dominant form of capitalism around the world. And I argued that this was a form of capitalism that really valorized self-interest, selfishness, the individual, at the expense of community, solidarity, a consideration of social justice. And we even see this fascinatingly with how pop song lyrics evolved from the 1980s onwards, where words such as we, us, and our were steadily supplanted by words such as me, myself, and I. And of course, an I-focused world was always going to be a more lonely one, I argue.
Yeah, I mean, I super didn't buy that, as you would imagine. I didn't. I thought it was like completely disagree with that. But I found out, sometimes I found it a bit hard to find the link really. But I did see obviously a lot of the strengths in lots of arguments that you made, and one of them was this whole question of the tension between security and liberty. And that comes out very well in urbanization. So one of the reasons people move to cities to be more prosperous, they'll be nearer jobs. And there's a lot of evidence, I think people, do like to live in cities, and that's why countries are urbanizing more. And one of the things you get from cities is anonymity in order to pursue your own lifestyle. Oh. So I wonder whether you think that we would have had gay rights without urbanization. Indeed, to some extent, whether some of these individual rights don't really depend on people being a bit more isolated from each other and not knowing each other's business. So you gave this fantastic section on Haredi community. Really, really interesting to find out they've got longer lifestyles and everything. But of course, they're unbelievably sexist, for example, and also against gay rights. And they insist on a certain they're very conformist, right? So
Yes.
In order to get the advantages that
Yes.
you posit, do you not
Yes.
have to have a high degree of conformity, and does that worry you?
So I make clear at various points in the book that we shouldn't romanticize community, and because communities are by definition excluding often to those who don't subscribe to their norms and their behaviors. And that's why the whole final part of my book is about how do we get communities to bridge, how do we bridge communities, how do we get different communities together. But at the same time, I acknowledge the value of community, the value of feeling that there are people looking out for you, that there are people who are helping you, that there are people who care for you, that communities do give. And there is a tension in my book that I draw out, about trade-offs between individuality and individualism and community. And I think they are real, and they can be real. But I also make clear that I can very much understand the drive to move to a city where there isn't the twitching of net curtains, and where you are able to live your own life. And I think it's about recognizing the complexities here and acknowledging them. And of course, I'm not suggesting for a second that we should aspire to some sort of society in which everyone's conforming to particular behaviors at all. And I cherish non-conformity and have done through my work. But yet, I also recognize that that there needs to be some give here.
Sure.
And that in order to have a more cohesive society, in order to bridge our divides, we do have to probably give up something, that we can't have it all.
So actually, I completely agree with that, and I quite strongly. It's always been a sort of strong strand of my politics too. So my disagreement on the role that neoliberalism plays doesn't make me disagree with you about that. But there are some other questions that arise always on this communitarian view, and one of the ones that kept coming up in conservative politics, and I wonder what your view is, was the question of marriage. Okay. And the role that marriage plays. So I was always quite persuaded of the data on marriage, that marriage is a beneficial institution, that partly because it made people more affluent, they lived in more affluent areas, partly because of the stability it offered, all sorts of reasons why it was a good thing. But I also recognized that talking about it meant you started lecturing people about their lives. And so that was always a political loser. There was always this tension. And I wondered where your research on loneliness had left you, considering that, you're also a very committed and an important liberal voice. So where does it leave you?
On marriage?
Yeah.
It leaves me thinking good, strong relationships matter, and having a strong support system matters. But it leaves me indifferent as to the form that takes. And so, recognizing, that marriages can be good or bad, meet those needs or not. And friendships can be, incredibly empowering and enriching too. So for me, thinking about moving forward and policy recommendations, it would be less around how do we incentivize people to get married, and it'd be more, how do we help people have stronger relationships in their lives, which is why kind of, things like paid time off for employees, to maternity pay, paternity pay, that's obviously good, but I would like to see us moving towards kind of statutory duties whereby people were able to take time off to care for others who may or may not be their blood relatives, to care for the neighbor in the street who kind of needs their help, to volunteer for a project in their local community. So for me, I absolutely recognize the importance of relationships, but I'm agnostic as to where, in what shape or form they take.
Would it be a fair point to suggest that all of the things that you talk about would mean probably as a collective we'd end up being poorer but happier? Or is that an unfair characterization? I tell you that, you know, if you
poorer in economic terms?
Yes.
No, there's nothing implicit in what I'm writing. Nothing that would suggest that. In fact, I make a strong case, I think, for loneliness having a significant economic cost, both in terms of healthcare burden on the health service, but also in terms of employers, where we see that lonely workers are less productive, less efficient, less motivated, more likely to jump ship. So actually, I think there's a very strong economic argument for investing in our social infrastructure, in our social capital, and also really importantly, in the infrastructure of community. And since 2008, we've just seen public libraries, public parks, youth centers, elderly daycare centers, community centers, all being really starved, depleted of funding. 130 public libraries were closed down in the UK last year. And so, you know, people need physical spaces where they can do things together if we are to come together. So, no, I think we would be richer in economic terms. We would have a more stable society in political terms, and we would feel better physically and mentally if we were to take this more seriously. And interestingly, Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, she's now really putting in a meaningful way well-being, improving loneliness, improving trust between citizens right at the heart of her budgetary process now, you know, really seeing it as integral to the success of her country as a whole.
So let's probe this issue, and we'll do this with a couple of audience questions of right-wing populism, because that's a very interesting strand. And it struck me that people could join in right-wing populist causes. Any sorts of groups, I suppose, would lead them away from being lonely. But it's very interesting that you think that was the case. So Jill Lewis has said, did you find that loneliness inclines people more towards right-wing populism rather than radical progressive movements? And what is working at and what's the thing that's producing that contrast?
It's a great question. It was something that as I was researching, I was kept on kind of thinking about and asking myself. So I think there's no clear reason why the people who I found were feeling so disaffected, so marginalized, so forgotten, so forsaken, were turning to right-wing populism rather than radical progressive movements of the left. Apart from right-wing populists seem to be speaking to their needs much more effectively, and both in their rhetoric. So if we think about Donald Trump or Marine Le Pen's speeches, they often talked about the forgotten people. The people was actually the phrase that Trump used most in his campaigning speeches. But also they were very across the board, right-wing populist parties have been really effective in the theatre of community that they have provided, whether it's Vlaam Belangs, the Belgian far-right populist party, which has kind of festivals, inside speeches about the dangers of Europe and outside bouncy castles for the kids, or of course the Trump rallies with the chants and the branded gear and everyone kind of, you know, feeling like these family affairs. So they've delivered it better. And what was interesting, for example, with the railroad workers in East Tennessee, who I heard from Trump voters in 2006 and now again in 2020, was that pretty much all of them had come from traditionally Democrat families. Yet they felt that the Democrats no longer spoke to them. And the diminishment of trade unions, I think, inevitably plays a part here too, because that did provide more of a sense of community and belonging for many people who now no longer have that. Of course, the right-wing populist parties, the proposition they offer is a very exclusive and an excluding community, defined as much by those who are not invited in. And there, what I found was they were, and maybe another reason, or undoubtedly another reason why they are faring better amongst those who feel lonely and marginalized, is because the research is pretty clear that if you are feeling lonely, and of course this isn't everyone who feels lonely, but you are on average, on balance, more likely to see the world as a hostile place, more likely to be threatened by outsiders, and also be more likely to be prey to conspiracy theories. So
I suppose, yeah, that's very, very interesting. But what I suppose also, if you're getting together in a group, in order for the group to provide something to you, a sense of community and a sense of belonging, isn't, you use evolution very well in the book and understand it. The clarity of thought's very good, but isn't excluding people part of what makes groups cohere, right? Setting one group again. So would that not be a sort of natural quality of exactly the sort of group that would reduce loneliness? Is it really possible to reduce loneliness with large, diverse, anonymous groups?
So I think this is it's not so binary. And because yes, I think there is, and I think this came out, I think my view evolved on this as I did this research. I recognized more than probably I ever had the role that place plays in community and locality and localism, more than I really had always seen myself as a global citizen who traveled around the world. And I didn't recognize, I think, the importance of place in a way, and how it kind of, and the role it plays. So I think there is something about community working particularly well in physical, more local spaces. But yet, I'm also convinced through so many inspiring examples that I came across in my book and my research, that it is possible to bridge communities. So this isn't about, so I recognize that communities by their nature tend to be exclusive, and that's why, and can be excluding, which is why I don't romanticize them. I recognize though that they do deliver safety, security, belonging to people, and that is something people crave. And then the question becomes, the big question is, how do you create these bridges then between these different communities? And there are, just one initiative that I love that I talked about in the book was actually launched by a German newspaper, Die Zeit, which got very concerned about growing political fragmentation in Germany. And what they did was they matched up thousands of Germans across the country with radically different political perspectives. And the people who got matched up then met up for just 2 hours. So people were meeting up in beer gardens, in cafes, in restaurants, someone who was anti-immigration with an asylum seeker, people of different socioeconomic groups, trade unionists with CEOs. And what was remarkable was just after 2 hours together, people's view of the other had radically changed. They saw the other person as much more human. They saw them as much more like someone like them. And I think, and there's a whole host of initiatives, a role I think for government to play too, for sure, in ensuring that different types of people are able to spend more time together, and doing things together proves to be really important.
Okay, so I've only got 2 or 3 minutes. I want to get 2 questions in for the last 3 or 4 minutes. So the first is to combine a couple of people, Tessa Rudnick and Alan Morgan. I'm basically asking. So Tessa points out the Beatles had Eleanor Rigby, all the lonely people,
Yes.
and what they're asking together is whether or not maybe we've just got less good at being lonely. That loneliness has always been a phenomenon, but we see the capabilities of connecting with other people, so we're less satisfied with being on our own, paradoxically. What do you think of that?
Yeah, so I think we need to differentiate between kind of solitude, which is something we might choose, and lonely, which is something we don't actually want and is something where we lack agency. So it isn't an active choice. And but I do think there is some truth to people are less good at doing things on their own, being on their own, kids playing on their own. I mean, I played on my own a lot as a kid. So I think there's definite truth in that. But I think when we're talking about loneliness, we're talking about something which is, a sense of powerlessness around one situation. It is different.
Okay, so the final question is from Lorraine Scher, and she asks this: do your views on loneliness lead you to endorse or to question Boris Johnson's relaxation of the COVID-19 rules over Christmas?
Well, I do not support them on health grounds and on a kind of precautionary principle basis. I think that unfortunately it is important that we stay apart even from our loved ones, and yet I absolutely recognize and acknowledge the toll it's taking, which is why what I wish is that at the same time as making announcements about lockdowns and tiers, the government was making a really serious investment in helping people get through this period of loneliness and isolation. And we've seen all the data on loneliness and isolation during the pandemic. It was already bad before, has shot up. Where is the budget? Where is the actual investment in helping people mentally get through this? Danny, maybe something you can raise.
Maybe. Look, that was terrific, a real privilege for me. And for all of us, you can buy a signed copy of Noreena's book for £35. That includes a £20 donation to One-to-One. And all you need to do is to say yes in the chat. And I believe an arrangement's been made, which will mean that Noreena will be signing the book. I really can recommend it. It was really eye-opening. So there are sometimes you read arguments and they're not really substantiated. I thought that it was a very good example of proper sustained argument that shifts your thinking and makes you appreciate that loneliness is, it's a very serious problem. As you would expect, I didn't agree with every part of every argument, but I never found it less than compelling, and I'm sure that our audience will too. So Noreena, thank you so much. Okay, so wonderfully, we have now for this double treat, we've got Anna Goodwin here. Hello, Anna. Thank you so much for being with us, and I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. Why don't we start with talking about the fact that you've got a mask on, and maybe you can tell us why you decided to do that.
So I always wear a mask for all my meetings and for all day at work these days, and I think they're really important. And there seems to be a misconception that we can't communicate with them on, and that we can't see people smile, for example, which I hope you can see when I'm smiling and my eyes raise. So I just thought it'd be helpful to show people that you can communicate through a mask, and I hope you'll hear me this evening.
Oh, wonderful! Thank you very much. Indeed, you're by the way, you're sort of persuaded medically of the benefits of having a mask.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think for all indoor environments, and probably also for a lot of outdoor environments. So I go for walks with my mum and we both wear masks. And I think it's a good way to just keep safe when you maybe might not be able to maintain the distance.
I wonder whether we're going to carry on actually once this crisis, carry on wearing them.
Yeah.
More prevalent. Yeah. Okay. Well, maybe I could start with a fairly broad question, but I think it'll be what's on everyone's mind. Can you just explain to us a little bit about there seems to be all these different vaccines. They seem to work with different, you know, it's a bit weird to me, you know, wasn't everyone just doing the same thing? What are the advantages? When we go, should we be saying, actually, I'd like, you know, the Pfizer one, or I don't want the Moderna one, or whatever? Tell us a little bit about them.
So people say to me, what's the best vaccine? Which should I have? And I say, it's the one that you're offered today, not the one you can have in a month. So, you know, we've got to be aware that the risks are high. So you want to have the vaccine you can have as soon as you can have it. At the moment, there's only one licensed vaccine in the UK, which is the Pfizer vaccine. All the vaccines have some common ground. They're all based on something called the spike protein, which is a particular part of the virus. And none of them contain live coronavirus. So I think they're the two big things people need to remember. Then they divide into, there's Moderna and Pfizer are quite similar. So Pfizer is the licensed Pfizer BioNTech vaccine. And both of those are based on genetic code in a way that's called messenger RNA. But the Oxford vaccine is also based on genetic code. It's just in a different way that it's expressed. It's called a viral vector. So essentially, all these ones that have been made quickly because in January, they had the genetic code, they could put it into a pipeline, and here we are less than a year later with vaccines that we can actually use. But so that's the differences are small. And this genetic code, so for the mRNA viruses, vaccines, you can't integrate it into your own genetic code. So it's not, there is some talk online, for example, of people saying, well, then it'll change my genetic code. That's not how it works. It produces something called an antigen, which induces antibodies in your body, which makes you immune. And then it sort of self-destructs, so it doesn't stay around.
Do you prefer, as a doctor, that we all try and get our heads around the vaccine, or should we just shut up and take it and not worry about it?
I prefer you just took it, yeah. Especially as, you know, what's going to be available will be different over different times. So the key thing is that things are safe and effective. And I think that's really exciting that we've got so much choice. So the day after we had our first vaccine, someone said, oh, but shouldn't I have this other vaccine? And I said, well, here we are one day into this, and we're being spoilt by choice, you know?
Yeah. Why do you think that it was possible? I mean, you've explained why we've moved so quickly, but were you a bit surprised we've ended up with a vaccine so quickly when we still haven't got one for AIDS, for example?
So yeah, so I've worked on malaria vaccines for years, and we struggle with that. And so I, at the beginning of this, said to my friends and family, well, you know, if we do really well, it'll be 50-60% effective, and then the next one will be better and better. And actually, it's almost the other way around. We've started with this amazingly effective vaccine. So I was so pleasantly surprised, but HIV and malaria have different aspects of them. So HIVs are more, well, it's the virus, the vaccine is against HIV, and there is prevention, you can use prevention, so you can take tablets now, so that's a huge step forwards, but we haven't managed to make a vaccine, probably mostly because the virus doesn't hang around for a long time and then it hides. So it hides in people's cells and then it's hard to vaccinate against it. Whereas coronavirus, there's plenty of virus knocking about when you acquire the virus, and it's been surprisingly easy to make vaccines that work, which is great.
Even people who are no way anti-vax and who are persuaded about vaccines, people who are quite happy to take vaccines, are a bit nervous in some cases about the speed of approval, thinking, well, you know, do we really know everything that we need to know about this? What might something go wrong? And that was all a bit unnerving with the Oxford vaccine and all that stuff about they tried it in different doses and everything. You begin to think, well, what actually has gone on there? So reassure us about the sort of approval process and safety.
So the MHRA and the FDA, they have a very, very high bar for safety for these things because you're giving vaccines to healthy people. So unlike medicines, which are allowed to have side effects, you don't want your vaccines to have much in the way of side effects. We accept they do, in that they all give you a bit of a headache or something mild that lasts a day, and that's to be expected. But there is a level at which people just wouldn't have them. So if your headache was so bad you couldn't go to work for a week, you probably wouldn't have the vaccine. So the side effects have to be quite mild for them to be tolerated. And for the MHRA and the FDA to sign them off, they have to be really satisfied that there isn't a risk to giving them at a population level to millions of people. And they've been given to tens of thousands of people now, these vaccines. So I can understand people's caution, but we've never worked this quickly before. So we've never tested on so many people so fast. So we test on tens of thousands of people, but we do it over a few years and then we analyze the data. So this is just, everything's been sped up this year. You've got to remember that these agencies have got to balance it against the fact of 1 in 1,000 people having passed away in the UK. So the sooner we get this, so there is a risk of not licensing and of not having a vaccine. It's not completely risk-free to not have a vaccine.
So tell me what the current science is telling us about, because I think either Patrick Vallance or Chris Whitty was discussing this today, about whether you can be infectious after you've had the vaccine.
So the great thing about the vaccines is they're so effective. And the nice thing is that we're vaccinating our sort of elderly population, vulnerable populations. So if those people are protected, then it shouldn't really matter if the people around them pass on virus. In terms of whether the vaccines will stop us passing on virus, that's a different question. And the Moderna and Pfizer ones didn't look at that in their trials, but the Oxford trial, we paired up with Public Health England, and every week people had a swab and they looked at if they were protected. And there is some signal of protection. It's hard to be really sure, and not all the data is yet in, but in the paper, you'll see that it's between 1/3 and 2/3 protection. So it's likely it does, to some degree, reduce your ability to transmit. The one thing it really does do is stop you getting sick with the virus. And of course, the flip side of that is maybe you wouldn't feel so sick, and maybe you would go and see someone. So we have to take it all as a combination with our masks and our alcohol and our elderly people being vaccinated as we move to a more hopeful time.
So will this immunity last?
So everybody hopes it's going to last for years, but we don't know much yet because it's such a new disease. We know that our own, natural immunity, I had this in April, and I know that lasted for 3 or 4 months, but I don't really know beyond that. And that's, with the vaccines, we'll only know as long as they've been around, how long the immunity is. But the fantastic thing is with these fast vaccines, they can be made, the next one can be made quickly. And it doesn't need to take a whole year to make the next one. You just stick the genetic code in, and just like we do with flu vaccines, we can get them off the pipeline very, very fast.
Can you explain to us what this thinking is about this new strain? What was I to make of that?
So we always knew there would be, it's called the new strain, but it's not actually the first new strain. We've had other new strains before. We always knew that this virus viruses all mutate. So we knew there would be new strains. And our worry about new strains, we only worry really if maybe the vaccine wouldn't work, or maybe they could spread quicker. They would be things that we will worry about. We haven't shown any of that yet. There is a worry. People are always worried, but I don't think, if we find that something does change, then like I've just said, we'll simply have to have a vaccine that works in a new way. But there's no evidence yet for this strain that it's changed in such a way.
But we're going to be living with, I suppose, variants of this coronavirus forever.
Hence my wearing a mask and getting used to the realities of how we live. So I think we can look forward to a time where we can see family and friends, where our elderly relatives are vaccinated, where we can all be together and comfortable together. But we probably do need, things will change, I suspect, in the way like in trains in Southeast Asia, where people wear masks routinely, more use of alcohol. So our hygiene methods will probably improve in that sense, and being more aware of transmission of these things.
Let me put a question that's a couple of questions from attendees. So the first one is, do you think that Pfizer should be avoided in people like myself with non-specific immune deficiency, as endocrinologist thinks?
So there's been no suggestion of that. So it's licensed in the UK for everybody, except people who are allergic, have severe allergy, and people who are pregnant and people on blood thinners. It's not really that they can't have it, but their blood thinners have to not be too bad so they don't get too bad a bruise. But for people who are immunosuppressed, we're giving it routinely now to people who are immunosuppressed. We are warning them that it may not work in the same, it may not be as effective, but that's, as more and more people are vaccinated, that hopefully won't matter as much.
And then another question, which is, would it be safe for me to have both, I hope I'm pronouncing this correct, Prevnar 13 and a COVID vaccine within a month or two of each other if I have frequent serious pneumonias?
So yes, absolutely. So the GPs are trying to get everybody their pneumococcal vaccines, which is what Prevnar is now, because they want to make sure that everyone's vaccinated against pneumonia and flu and COVID this winter. But absolutely, you can have them close together. They're saying the aim is for it to be 7 to 14 days apart, but if somebody shows up for a vaccine, we don't want them to miss that important chance of a vaccine and get COVID next week. So they would still probably receive it.
Anna, that was absolutely terrific. You didn't need to wear that mask so that nobody knew who you were. Your question, brilliant, and thank you for the exposition. You proved your point. It was completely clear with the mask on, but most of all, it was intellectually very clear as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you,
David. Back to you.
Well, thank you. First of all, Danny, hosting two fascinating discussions. All I could think was, if only we had Noreena in the advisory board panel of number 10, if we had Anna, a senior person on SAGE, we get empathy and clarity, and we get what's frustrating us all this time. So I mean, to me, that was that shone through. This webinar showed that that there's thinking out there that's clear, that's wise, that's empathetic, and that we're not seeing from government right now. I hope it improves, and I hope we get the Brexit deal, and everyone can feel a little bit more confident about where we're going in the future. But thank you both, and thank Danny. What I took from Noreena is that connection is central to resilience, and resilience is central to building communities. From what hit me in the stomach really in listening to Anna was that there in the HIV world, we've been searching for a vaccine for almost 40 years. And the speed of the COVID vaccine has been incredible. I mean, absolutely amazing. But what it puts into context is the work that we're doing in the Eastern Cape, where many of our mentor mothers are HIV positive, but they've used their connection with the community, and they've used their frontline role in the pandemic to harness the community, to continue their proactive healthcare, identify sources of infection, trace all their contacts, and provide food for the most vulnerable. And these are the women of the Eastern Cape. It's their resilience that drives the community and drives our work. And amidst their own personal challenges, they somehow always find the strength to sing. And amongst the dark clouds, there's always a sliver of light. And it's that hope of a better future for these vulnerable families that drives us at 1-to-1. And it looks like we're going to need to continue to provide the pandemic support that we have been for months and months to come, whether it's PPE, food parcels, everything that these mentor mothers are doing. And they're going to be very low on the vaccine list in terms of when they're going to get it in their part, certainly in South Africa and in their part of rural South Africa. And that's why we have a campaign at the moment called Triple It. And we've had a couple of major donors, lovely donors who are tripling everything that anyone donates during the month of December. So every donation in December is going to be matched 3 times the value. And the great news is that we've already reached 70% of our initial £100,000 target. I hope it's going to be a moving target. So it would be great if everyone helps us to get this over the line and beyond. And you can do that by donating, but you can also do that by sending out the link to your networks. And the link to the donate page should be in the chat. The £20 profit that we're making on Noreena's books will also be tripled, Noreena. So that's a great contribution.
Great to hear.
Yeah, thank you. So thank you everyone for being with us tonight. This is the last of this year's webinars. Danny, thanks to you for hosting all of them, and such amazing people ending tonight in this way. We'll be back with you probably towards the end of January next year with a whole new slew of pertinent webinars. And even if if there's something immediate that we need to know, Anna, you were great to respond so quickly and say on Sunday and say, yes, I'll be with you. So that's fantastic. And Noreena, likewise, just a total privilege to have you with us. So have a good evening, everyone. And thanks so much, and wishing you well over the festive season. 6th night Hanukkah tonight, and Christmas is coming, and the new year too. So let's look forward and wish you all well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.